The Galactic Empire stood as the undisputed ruler of the stars. Across countless worlds, they had crushed resistance with ease, bending species to their will, their banners draped over 1,000 conquered civilizations. Their fleets blotted out suns. Their soldiers marched with the certainty of gods. When their warships loomed over Earth, they expected the same outcome. But humanity had not been conquered. It wasn't because they had better weapons. It wasn't because they had superior numbers. It was because they had something the Empire had never encountered before, an enemy that refused to break. The war should have ended in weeks. Instead, it raged for years. Planets turned to graveyards. Entire fleets were torn apart in ambushes. Human resistance cells struck like phantoms, dismantling supply lines, assassinating generals, vanishing before retaliation could come. No matter how many humans the Empire slaughtered, the survivors only fought harder. And through it all, one name kept resurfacing. A name whispered among Imperial officers. A name that sent a chill through even the most hardened soldiers. Baba Yaga. No records. No known origin. No confirmed sightings. Only devastation left in his wake. He was a myth the Empire told themselves. A story rebels clung to for hope. But when entire battalions went dark, when commanders were found gutted in their own bunkers, when elite hunters sent after him never returned, the Empire began to wonder. Then the Emperor made his first mistake. He declared that Baba Yaga was nothing more than a ghost story, an illusion of war. He mocked the rebels, calling their so-called legend a coward who feared facing the Empire openly. He set a trap, a spectacle for the entire galaxy to witness. A captured human, beaten, bloodied, chained before the cameras. The execution was meant to be a message. Humanity's last warrior, broken before the eyes of the galaxy. The Emperor himself watched from his throne, confident that the last embers of resistance would die with this execution. But the Empire had never truly understood what they were dealing with. The moment the executioner's blade was raised, everything changed. The guards fell first, their bodies collapsing before they could scream. The executioner's head rolled across the floor. Chains shattered as if made of glass. The figure that stood in the center of the massacre was not a prisoner. He was not a victim. He was something far worse. Baba Yaga. The cameras kept rolling. The galaxy watched as the execution turned into a slaughter. Guards rushed in, screaming orders, firing weapons. They were dead before they hit the ground. Baba Yaga moved like a shadow, a force of nature, a nightmare given flesh. He didn't run. He didn't hesitate. Every motion was deliberate. Every kill was absolute. The Emperor watched, silent, his face pale. Then Baba Yaga turned toward the camera. Blood dripped from his hands. His gaze was empty, cold. "I'm coming for you." The feed cut. The Empire's greatest show of dominance had become a broadcasted declaration of war. Panic erupted in the capital. Entire fleets were mobilized, orders screaming through comms. Soldiers braced for the impossible. The Emperor himself retreated to his fortress, surrounded by his most elite guards. None of them knew it was already too late, because Baba Yaga wasn't just a man. He was war itself, and he had just begun. The capital was on fire. The moment the execution broadcast cut, the Empire knew terror. The streets locked down, soldiers deployed, gunships patrolling the skies. Curfews were enforced, arrests were made. But no matter how tight their grip, it wasn't enough. Because they weren't dealing with an army. They were dealing with something they couldn't predict. They were dealing with him. Baba Yaga had already disappeared into the underbelly of the city, moving like a ghost. Imperial forces flooded every checkpoint, scanning every face, tracking every movement. But he was never where they expected. By the time a location was locked down, all they found were bodies. It wasn't just the kills. It was the message behind them. Officers were found hanging from street lamps, their own weapons stuffed into their mouths. Supply convoys exploded before they could leave their depots. High-ranking officials vanished from their estates, only for their heads to be left outside the Emperor's palace. Fear spread like a disease. The Emperor had seen rebellions before. He had crushed insurgencies, obliterated entire species that defied him. But this wasn't a war. This was something else. His empire wasn't facing an uprising. It was being hunted. Desperation set in. The Apex Legion, the Empire's most feared warriors, were called in. These were the elite, battle-forged in 1,000 campaigns. They had razed civilizations to the ground. They had never failed. They were deployed in full force, sweeping through the capital with brutal precision. If Baba Yaga was hiding, they would drag him into the light. He let them believe that. The first squad went dark within hours. The second shortly after. The Empire's greatest warriors, the ones who had never known defeat, were picked apart like prey. Their bodies were left where they fell, their armor shattered, their weapons turned against them. The city held its breath. The Emperor ordered lockdown protocols across the palace, reinforcing every corridor, doubling every guard. No one entered. No one left. He was safe behind walls that had never been breached. But he had never fought someone like Baba Yaga. The attack came at night. Explosions ripped through the outer defenses, plunging the palace into chaos. Alarms blared. Troops scrambled to defensive positions. The Emperor sat in his throne room, heart pounding, gripping the armrests. Then the lights flickered. Comms cut. The screams started. One by one, squads went silent. Security feeds showed brief flashes. Shadows moving, figures dropping. The Emperor's elite, the best-trained killers in the Empire, reduced to panicked voices begging for backup before they were snuffed out. Then the doors to the throne room opened. The Emperor's guards raised their weapons, hands shaking. The figure that stepped inside was alone. He didn't speak. He didn't hesitate. The room became a slaughterhouse. The Emperor tried to flee, scrambling for the hidden passage behind his throne. He didn't make it. A hand closed around his throat, dragging him back. The ruler of 1,000 worlds, the God-King of the Galactic Empire, was thrown to the ground like an animal. For the first time in his life, he felt fear. Baba Yaga loomed over him, eyes dark, breathing steady. The Emperor struggled, screaming for his guards, his soldiers, his empire. But no one was coming. "You thought I was a myth," Baba Yaga said. His voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. "You thought I was afraid." He grabbed the Emperor by the collar, yanking him up, forcing him to face the shattered remains of his throne room. "You should have run." Then he dragged him out. The streets were silent. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that came when death walked openly. The people of the capital watched from the shadows, from behind locked doors and shuttered windows. They had lived under the Empire's rule for generations, crushed beneath its power. They had seen rebels rise and fall, had watched executions in the plazas, had learned that resistance only led to graves. But now they saw something they had never imagined. Their emperor, the untouchable ruler of the stars, was being dragged through the streets like a beaten dog. His robes, once symbols of absolute power, were torn and stained with blood. His face, always hidden behind a regal mask, was bare, twisted with pain and fear. And the one dragging him moved with the same quiet certainty that had turned an empire into prey. No guards came to save the emperor. No armies rushed to his aid. The most powerful man in the galaxy had no power left. The people watched, afraid to believe what they were seeing. They had been raised on the empire's might, had been taught that their rulers were invincible. But here, in the heart of their world, invincibility was bleeding onto the pavement. Baba Yaga didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every step, every pull of the emperor's body through the dirt was a message. The empire wasn't just losing, it was already lost. Then the whispers began. They started as murmurs, hushed voices barely daring to breathe the words. But they grew, louder, stronger. Faces appeared in windows, doors creaked open. People stepped into the streets, eyes wide, disbelieving. The empire had ruled through fear, but fear had a new face now, and it wasn't theirs anymore. The first to move were the ones who had suffered the most. The workers, the servants, the ones who had never been anything more than background figures in the empire's grand machine. They stepped forward, surrounding the scene, watching as their ruler was dragged through the filth like the countless victims he had sentenced before. Then someone spit. It was a small thing, a single act, but it shattered something. A rock flew, then another, then another. The emperor screamed, not in command, not in rage, but in terror. He tried to crawl, tried to speak, but there was nothing left for him to say. The crowd surged. Baba Yaga let go. He stepped back as the people took what was theirs. The ruler of 1,000 worlds vanished beneath the weight of those he had once ruled. And in that moment the empire fell. The empire was dead, but its remnants still twitched, refusing to accept the inevitable. Across the galaxy, warships scrambled for order, generals screamed into dead calms, and governors barricaded themselves in their palaces, hoping that if they held out long enough, things would return to the way they were. But the illusion of control was gone. The capital had fallen. The emperor was nothing more than a memory, torn apart by the very people who had once feared him. And the name that had haunted the empire for years was now carved into history: Baba Yaga, the man who had broken the unbreakable. And he wasn't finished. The empire's last loyalists tried to rally, gathering their fleets, calling for a counterstrike. They swore vengeance, promising that this rebellion would be burned from existence. But their words rang hollow. The empire had built itself on power, on the idea that it could never be challenged. Now that illusion had been shattered. The people they had ruled for centuries had seen the truth. They weren't ruled by gods. They were ruled by men. Men who bled. Men who could fall. And they had fallen. One by one, planets rose. The outer colonies, once too afraid to even whisper of resistance, erupted in revolt. Garrison troops found themselves surrounded by those they had once oppressed. Shipyards turned against their overseers. Dock workers sabotaged fleets before they could launch. There was no central command, no grand strategy. There didn't need to be. The empire had relied on fear to maintain order, and that fear had turned. Now it was the soldiers who looked over their shoulders, the governors who lay awake at night, wondering when their doors would be kicked in. And at the center of it all, Baba Yaga moved like a shadow. He didn't claim power. He didn't raise a flag or give speeches. He was never in one place for long, always appearing where the last remnants of the empire thought they were safe. The strongholds they had built, the bunkers they had retreated to, the hidden fleets they had hoped would restore their rule. None of it mattered. One by one, they fell. The last admirals died aboard their burning ships, the final warlords executed by the very soldiers they had once commanded. Entire fleets vanished into the void, abandoned or destroyed, until there was nothing left. And then, just as suddenly as he had arrived, Baba Yaga was gone. No one knew where he went. Some said he had died with the empire, his purpose fulfilled. Others believed he still walked among the stars, watching, waiting. A reminder of what had happened. A warning of what could happen again. But in the end, it didn't matter. The Galactic Empire, the great unbreakable force that had once ruled the stars, was no more. All that remained was the legend. The galaxy had changed. What was once the heart of the Galactic Empire was now a smoldering ruin. Its banners torn down. Its fleets shattered. Its rulers reduced to whispers of a forgotten age. The planets that had once bowed to its might now stood on their own. Some forging new alliances, others descending into chaos. But one question remained. What happened to Baba Yaga? Some believed he had vanished the moment the last remnants of the empire fell. Others claimed to have seen him, a shadow moving between worlds, never staying in one place for long. Stories spread, of a lone figure appearing where the powerful grew too comfortable, where new rulers began to resemble the tyrants they had replaced. He left no armies, no followers, no legacy beyond the silence he carved into history. But the scars he left behind would never fade. The empire's former generals, the ones who had survived by fleeing into the void, still spoke his name in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting him to appear from the darkness. Mercenary lords and war profiteers, hoping to carve out new domains from the fallen empire's corpse, quickly learned to tread carefully. Because the moment they became too bold, too cruel, too much like the rulers who had fallen before them, something happened. Their ships failed. Their enforcers disappeared. Their strongholds, once impenetrable, turned into tombs overnight. No one ever saw him. No one ever heard him. But the message was always the same. The galaxy belonged to the living, not to tyrants, not to emperors. And so the legend grew. Children whispered his name in the dark, warning each other that he watched from the shadows. Soldiers on distant worlds carried his story like a prayer, a reminder that even the most powerful could fall. The rulers who emerged after the empire's fall did so with caution, never daring to call themselves emperors, never claiming absolute rule. Because they knew, the moment they did, the moment they tried to rebuild what had been broken, to raise themselves above the rest, he would return. The embers of the fallen empire still smoldered, but its fire had been extinguished. The galaxy stood at the edge of something new, something uncertain. In the void left behind, warlords and opportunists tried to seize power, but they moved carefully, always looking over their shoulders. Because fear had not vanished. It had only changed hands. They whispered his name in the dark. The one who had torn down the throne. The one who had walked through fire and left nothing but ruin in his wake. Baba Yaga. Some called him a myth, a story crafted by those who had lived under tyranny for too long. But the ones who had witnessed his wrath knew better. They had seen the bloodied bodies of the empire's greatest warriors, the shattered fleets that once ruled the stars. They had seen an emperor dragged through the streets, his pleas swallowed by the very people who had once trembled at his command. So they ruled with caution. The new powers that rose did not dare call themselves emperors. They avoided the symbols of the past, the grand palaces, the statues, the titles that had once carried absolute authority. The galaxy did not tolerate such things anymore. And yet, in the shadows, there were those who still hungered for more. On the distant fringes of the galaxy, where the empire's reach had once stretched but never fully gripped, whispers of a new order began to grow. Former admirals, exiled nobles, and surviving imperial officers gathered in secret, speaking of restoration, of reclaiming what was lost. They did not fear Baba Yaga. They believed he was gone. They believed they could rebuild what had been broken. But the galaxy had changed. The people had changed. And he was never truly gone. Because the moment they began to rise, the moment they started speaking of conquest, of dominion, of power, they started to disappear. Their ships were found adrift in space, their crews slaughtered with precision too sharp to be random. Their hidden strongholds collapsed into ruin, their leaders silenced before their plans could take root. No one ever saw him. No one ever heard him. But the message was always the same. The age of emperors was over.